Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of the Triangle SQL Server Users Group. We have a bonus stream tonight, so this is outside of our normal cadre of sessions. We have for us, by special request from Tracy, Corey Hambrick is here talking to us about AWS versus Azure, and for DBAs, what is the difference? So without further ado, I'm going to hand it straight over to Corey.
I appreciate the opportunity, and it's a pleasure to be joining you guys this evening. First time to be doing this on a live stream, so looking forward to kind of seeing how it goes, and just enjoy any input and questions you guys have along the way. So again, the topic tonight we're talking about is AWS versus Azure. What is the difference to the DBA? As Kevin introduced me, my name is Corey Hambrick. I'm a database administrator with Cafepress out of Louisville, Kentucky. And my Twitter handle is at HambonedDBA. I chose that title because Hambone is what they used to call me in college, and I just don't know why. I just thought it was kind of a different handle. So you can always reach me at that Twitter account. I have been a DBA for over, or database involved with databases for over 20 years. I've actually worked some on SQL 7, but it was very minimal, so I don't count it that often. But I remember some of the screenshots from 7 and things like that. So been working with SQL 2000 through 2017 for the last 20 years as a database analyst and as a database administrator for over 15 years now. So excited to be sharing things with you guys this evening. Some of the things I'm most passionate about are our family. If I had my druthers, I would be in the mountains somewhere. I also enjoy doing ministry. I do prison ministry with our drug rehabs and substance abuse programs here in our local county jail in our area. I also enjoy cars. My son is 15 years of age and loves cars, and so I also love SQL Saturdays. I've been involved with SQL Saturdays for the last 3.5 years as I started working in Louisville. I was in Lexington, Kentucky for 10 years as a database administrator with a law firm, and we really did not have much of a SQL Server community there. But that has actually grown a lot in the last couple of years as I've been out of Lexington. But so I'm really passionate about SQL Saturdays because they've been a real help to me to grow professionally. And I also want to say a special thank you to your own Tracy Bogiano. I believe I said it right, but Tracy has been a real mentor to me, and so has Matthew, or Matt Gordon, who is the actual lead for the Lexington users group that's grown in Lexington. Both of them have been really instrumental to me to encourage me to be a speaker. And I'll just say a quick encouragement to anybody out there. For a couple of years, I've always wanted to present, but I wasn't sure if I had any topic to contribute. And I really do feel like we all have something that we can share and learn from each other. So I really want to encourage you guys to consider presenting in some of the SQL venues that we all have access to, because we all could really share and help with each other grow. So a little understanding about where this presentation came from. Last year, I was at a SQL Saturday event, and I was at a presentation where they were talking about the DBA tools and SQL Server. And the presenter was talking about the DBA tools with Azure. And I asked the question about how well they would work with AWS. And the presenter made some rather disparaging marks about AWS. And at the end of the presentation, as we were leaving, somebody grabbed me from the audience and asked the question, why was the person talking so bad about AWS? And I said, I don't know, I have some thoughts, but I'm not sure. And so that really made me want to start looking at comparing AWS. My current company, we've been in AWS for several years, but we just recently migrated our data center back in April of last year through June of last year over to AWS. So we are now exclusively within AWS. But anyway, as this speaker was talking so bad about AWS, I came to later find out that this person was actually a current or former Microsoft employee. So I could understand where some of the disparaging remarks were coming from. But it just really made me kind of want to look and see why is Azure so different from AWS? What are the differences? How do you do things? What do they do? How do they compare in the way that you're relating back and forth with technology? And so, what's the difference to us as DBAs and how that works, and how we decide what platforms we like? And so that's really where the presentation has come from, is to try to give some sort of a comparison to that topic. So kind of a brief outline. One of the things that I'm going to talk about is why I think this presentation is important to you as a DBA. And then we'll start getting into some of the nuts and bolts about some of the differences. We'll talk about choosing editions and versions of SQL Server. We'll talk about how backups and restores are done. We'll talk about monitoring. We'll talk about patch management. We'll talk about using PowerShell in the environments. And then I'll talk, kind of wrap it up with giving you, if I had the opportunity to actually choose, which one would I choose and why? And the thing that we'll do is, as we take each topic, we will compare AWS, and then we'll compare Azure SQL DB, and then we'll compare Azure Managed Instances. And then I'll kind of summarize the differences between the three as we get through each topic. There are other platforms, obviously Google and different platforms that provide SQL Server, but since those are the two most popular, that is kind of where I've decided to take this. And I originally had 18 different topics to really talk about, but there's so many differences, so many different topics to use, that's kind of where I've narrowed it down. And maybe I'll make a second version presentation to actually talk about some of those others topics as well. But at this point, this is kind of where we're hitting. So I hope you'll find it interesting. So I think one of the things that you'll find out when you look at this particular topic, SQL Server in the cloud, as you look across some of the SQL Saturdays, I found this a really revealing and sort of informative of idea. I took all of the submitted sessions across many SQL Saturdays from last year. And obviously the submitted sessions are not the sessions that were chosen, but those submitted sessions, I looked for the word Azure, and I also looked for the word AWS or Amazon within either the title or the subject or description of the session. And what I found was that there really is a platform bias towards Azure as you look at so many of these topics. Now, again, these submitted were not the ones that were necessarily selected, but these were submitted topics. And you can see that there's a large gravitation towards Azure. And I think some of that's natural. SQL Server is a Microsoft product. Azure is Microsoft owned. So obviously I think there's a natural fit there. But so it's just really interesting that although AWS is supposed to have such a higher market share of the cloud overall, within the SQL Saturday realm, there's not that many sessions that are talked about across SQL Saturdays. But back in October of last year, and AWS has actually become a platinum partner with PASS. And so I do think that we're going to start to see more Azure discussions, or I'm sorry, AWS discussions within some of the SQL Saturday events. I know I was going to be presenting this a couple weeks ago before it was canceled due to the COVID-19 at SQL Saturday in Cincinnati. And there were, if I remember correctly, I think 3 other SQL Saturday sessions that had some connections with AWS. So another reason that I think that this is really an important topic for you to be aware of is there really are a lot of features across the different platforms that may not necessarily share within each platform. This is a graphic that explains some of those differences between SQL Server products that I got. Every source that I've tried to take information from, I have tried to include a link down at the bottom or at the end of the slideshow. So that is something that hopefully you'll actually have access to these different sources as you go through and look at the presentation later on in the future, if you decide to do that. But again, so here's some of those feature comparisons with that are not currently supported with AWS. So as you go through and you look at your current on-premise setup, are you using an enterprise feature that maybe this enterprise feature isn't usable or isn't even allowed within AWS, or maybe it's not allowed within Azure? So it's important to really think about the way that you currently do things. And I realize some people, the audience that I'm talking to, has a mixture of, probably some people are not in the cloud yet. Maybe some people have some systems in the cloud or limited, and there may be even some people that are much like my situation where they're fully in the cloud. And so how you do things will change as you go to the cloud, and those features can play a part in that as far as how you're going to do things. And then I think the reason, again, the other reason that this is important to you is if you are in the process of transitioning to the cloud, or even you are thinking about it and you're not there yet. How you do things in the cloud, you've heard it. It's very different than the way that you do things on-prem. Some of the things that we thought we would be doing in the cloud, we planned it a certain way when we got there, and we realized we can't do it that way. And even some things that we didn't even think about moving to the cloud, we have not even been able to, we hadn't even thought about how we were going to do those things. It hadn't even crossed our minds. So there's just going to be a lot of changes to how you do things on your, in your local on-prem environment as opposed to when you go to the cloud. And so hopefully some of the things that I'll talk about, while I may be talking about them specifically in AWS or Azure, it might at least spur you on to think a little bit about how you would move forward and do your cloud changes. So some of the topics to me, again, as you transition to the cloud, how do you do refreshing of your databases from your production to your dev environments? Do your current monitoring solutions support the cloud? Are you doing integrity checks, DB mail, system alerts? Do you use a lot of the SQL agent functionality, and will that be available in the cloud? How are you currently doing backups and restores and patches? If you do failovers, what is that going to look like when you go to the cloud? And PowerShell is big. If you've spent a lot of time developing a PowerShell library of scripts that you use, how is that going to work when you go to the cloud? So those are, again, some of the things that, I'll obviously I can't address every one of those, but maybe I'll encourage you to think about it as you are transitioning to the cloud. So again, just to reiterate, what we'll do is with each topic, we'll compare it in order. We'll do AWS, we'll compare SQL Azure DB, single instance database, and then we'll do a managed instance and kind of talk about the difference between those in that order. So starting with choosing an edition and a version of SQL Server. With AWS, you actually, and again, also reiterate, we're talking about RDS, platform as a service. We're not talking about using EC2 or virtual machines. We're literally talking about the platform as a service where we're using SQL Server. With AWS RDS, you can choose your versions of SQL Server, except for developer. If you are going to use a developer instance, you would have to use that within a virtual machine, or EC2 is what AWS calls virtual machines. And this has been really huge for us because we have used SQL Standard for a lot of our servers. In our production level, but in order to cut some of those licensing costs, we've actually gone and used, as some of our development servers, we've used the web edition. So obviously that goes into play with our whole features, what might work in SQL Standard that won't work in web edition. So we have to think through certain things like that as we take databases from one system to another. So once you choose the version or the edition of SQL Server that you're wanting to use, then you go in with AWS and you choose the version that you want to use. They support all the way back to SQL 2012, just like you do with compatibility current environment. Currently, as of today, SQL 2019 is not available under AWS as a supported version. AWS is slower to apply cumulative updates. This right here is the current highest version of SQL 2017 that's supported, which is CU 16. And I think that came out, if I remember correctly, in August of last year. So, AWS is slower to adopt the cumulative update patches that get applied to your versions of SQL Server. Now, with SQL Server in AWS, the licensing is included. And so here you're kind of seeing an example where we've selected a database instance class. We're using 16 CPUs, 122 gigabytes of RAM, with estimated throughput of 3,000 megabits per second on storage. And apologize if y'all are hearing the dinging. I think my email app's open. So you can see here, this is just sort of your out-of-the-box pricing. This is not, reserve pricing where you can buy 1 year and 3 year instances and get a much more discounted price. So I just wanted to kind of give you an example. So this is a single instance monthly cost, estimated monthly cost of a SQL Server with this metric. Now, if I was going to create a failover, then you'll immediately notice the price doubles. That's the thing that you have to really realize with AWS. The license is included with every instance that you spin up. There is no passive ability to use software mobility or software assurance with licenses. So you cannot do a bring your own license with you. Now, if you see any screens like this in any previous documentation, they used to do this with AWS RDS, but it stopped, from what I gather, around 2018, first quarter, maybe second quarter. So it is no longer allowed. You have to buy licensing, which is included with every instance that you purchase. So you can quickly see that AWS can be an expensive option because even those failover options, those passive servers, you're paying for the licensing on those instances. So that's essentially choosing your edition and version with AWS. Now, when you look at Azure, whether it's SQL DB or a managed instance, there really is no edition or version. As you look through these screens, you don't really have the option to choose any sort of an edition. It's always going to be SQL Server at an enterprise level, either enterprise features that are available to you on the single instance database or on a managed instance. Just to give you a comparative pricing, currently, I tried over the last couple of weeks to get in and actually get some screenshots showing what it would cost to spin up a solution with similar 16 cores. And I can't start an instance on any of the Azure regions. It's because, I guess, of COVID-19. So many of their resources are being dedicated, and mine's just a Visual Studio subscription, so that I couldn't spin up anything to actually even get any pricing. So I just had to use the price calculator. But you can see that, for a single database with 16 cores, I'm looking at, something similar. But down here at the very bottom, you may not be able to see it too well. Let's see if I can zoom in. Just trying to remember. There we go. So this question down here at the bottom, where it's, you can save up with Azure hybrid benefit, meaning taking your licenses through software assurance, you can actually discount that back from what that current price is looking at. So when you query an Azure database, you will see that it says that it is SQL Azure. That's your version. One thing I find interesting is that it looks like it's version 2012, or I'm sorry, 2014 with your 12.0, but it is Azure SQL DB. So, and again, this hybrid benefit, this is really an important thing. It can only be used with vCore license or vCore machines, but you can bring your own license with software assurance as part of this hybrid benefit. And essentially, this FAQ down here at the bottom that I have a link to kind of goes more into depth about it. But as a summary, essentially the hybrid benefit is something that it's an Azure-based benefit that's associated with software assurance to help you pay a reduced rate on a base rate for your different machines. So something to really take advantage of with Azure. Now, on a managed instance, it's very much the same way. Again, you don't really have any way of choosing a version. It's just going to be an enterprise edition of the database engine. This pricing looks much higher than it really could be. One of the things that I forgot in my screenshot was to actually change the service tier to general purpose. It's in business class. It's one of the reasons that it's higher. If I were to take that same screen and change it to general, it actually goes down to a similar price as the single database instance. And one other point of note, the prices that you are seeing on the Azure screens is just dealing with the vCore. It's not showing, it's further down the page, but I didn't really have the opportunity to get any vCore pricing with storage and all that. So I just wanted you guys to be aware that that's just literally dealing with the vCore costs. But again, you can see that it is somewhat similar. And again, querying the database, you'll come back that it is SQL Server Azure, and you can deal with the managed instance also using your software mobility. Now, you guys may be familiar with what a managed instance is, but let me just kind of make sure that everybody's on the same page about it. Over a few slides, let's talk about it, because this really is, I think, a critical piece to think about. So SQL Managed Instance, it's rather than a single database, it is a full SQL Server, as close as you can get to being similar to being an on-premise server. But it still falls under the platform as a service guidelines, same functionality as you get with your platform as a service offerings, features. So it's near 100% compatibility. It is the closest you can think of as having the same equivalent of SQL Server in the cloud as you have on-prem, but it's also the enterprise edition, but it also relates to the database engine. And what I mean by that is, if you're on-prem, if you're used to running your analysis services and integration services and those features, reporting services, those are services, but they're not related to the database engine. So when you spin up a managed instance, you get the same features and functionality that you get with a database engine, but you can't go run management services, or I'm sorry, reporting services on that managed instance, because that's a separate service, unlike the database engine. So that what I'm saying is that this is like having a SQL Server in the cloud as 100% as possible. Obviously, it's not fully 100% compatible, but it is as close as you can get to running SQL Server in the cloud, like you're used to being on-prem. And so I want to take a minute to just kind of talk about software assurance, because when SQL 2019 came out, some changes happened to the software assurance. Now, I'm certainly not claiming to be a licensing expert, but I think it's important that we all really understand some of the criticality and the importance of licensing, because sometimes, in my experience, a lot of my CIOs and managers have looked to me to give some guidance on how we should do some of our licensing as we were laying out new servers and things. So I want to spend just some slides kind of talking about some of these changes to software assurance, because it's some really cool features, but also some very significant changes for us as administrators. So the old traditional software assurance, for a long time, people really didn't want to keep software assurance. When SQL Server was only releasing once every 3 to 5 years, a lot of times people didn't want to carry that software assurance from year to year to year because it took so long for the next version to come out. But now, as SQL Server is being released much more quickly, I would say at a minimum every 24 months, that software assurance becomes kind of a much more critical piece that enables us to move our versions ahead. Typically with software assurance, we've been given the benefit of having a free passive instance for high availability configurations. So we're only having to literally pay for one set of licenses for our server, and we have that free passive version. As long as it stayed truly passive, we didn't do anything with it. As of November 1st, 2019, if you're a software assurance customer with SQL Server, there has been some enhancements to these benefits. We now have 3 benefits that are really, really critical and very beneficial for us. First benefit, it's very much the same thing. We have the ability to have that failover server for high availability. So the passive server that we're used to still have that availability. But our second benefit is we now have the ability to have another failover server for disaster recovery. So you can have 2 servers there, one for high availability and one for disaster recovery. And your third benefit is you now are even allowed to have another failover server in Azure for disaster recovery. So what that literally allows us to do is we've licensed a single server. We can now have your synchronous copy for high availability. You can have an asynchronous copy for DR, and those are both on-prem. And then you can now have a third copy up in Azure for DR as an asynchronous copy. So, I mean, you're literally looking at one server has been licensed, and I now have these free other secondary passive copies that I can use for from a licensing perspective, 1 of 4. I mean, that is a huge benefit. And as I understand, and I cannot verify this, you would need to probably get with some real licensing experts. But as I understand, with the release of SQL Server 2019, the software assurance is no longer available. You can no longer take your licenses and go put them on like a virtual machine within Google or within AWS. You can only use your software mobility and your license mobility on these licenses with Azure virtual machines or Azure databases. Again, you'll need to verify that with your licensing experts, but That's what I'm understanding. And that is a huge cost to anybody that wants to run SQL Server in some other platform. You're talking about a lot of potential savings for your licensing costs. And we all know that licenses are the most expensive part of SQL Server at the core level. There's also been some changes that have been allowed on our passive copies. So we now have the opportunity to do database consistency checks on our passive copies. We can also do full and log backups on our passive copies. And we can also monitor our resource usage on those passive copies. So some of that functionality that we had to do on the primary we now actually have the ability to do those on those passive copies without it becoming a fully licensed instance. So again, just to kind of reiterate and just to kind of touch on some of these again. So with AWS, you have the ability to choose your versions. And again, for us, that's been a real critical thing, because it gives us the ability to control some of those licensing costs more. But we do not have the ability to do bring your own license. And we actually were in a place where we never bought software assurance, so we really couldn't even do it anyway. But if we had, as I understand it today, you cannot take your software assurance to anything but Azure-based instances. But the feature support is, again, because you can choose your version with SQL Server, now your feature support becomes real important. So for example, if I wanted to go use, let's say that I have a enterprise version of SQL Server on-prem, we use Resource Governor. So that now means I know I'm going to have to go license an enterprise version in AWS, but then I start getting into, is Resource Governor an acceptable feature that's supported within AWS? And it's not. So that's where I'm just kind of talking about, you need to really understand what features you're trying to use. And then, so with AWS, you have to choose your version that'll support those features, but then you have to figure out, is that feature actually even a supported feature in AWS? Now with Azure, again, the features is really a very good and nice thing. You may not be aware of this, but this is where I was trying to say, when you create an Azure SQL DB, you're getting some of the enterprise features at the database level. And for example, online index rebuilds is an enterprise-only feature. But if you have an Azure SQL DB, you can actually do an online index rebuild on that instance. So you're getting an enterprise feature, but it's at a more at the database related level, because it's a database feature rather than the whole server level. And again, as you have a managed instance, SQL managed instance, again, it's as close to being 100% on-prem, so you have a lot of those enterprise features on that instance that you wouldn't have if you chose AWS and you use SQL Standard. So this just kind of gives you an idea. The addition in the version's kind of been critical for us as an AWS presence because of the whole licensing cost. So Kevin, if anybody has any questions now, it might be a good time before we go to the next topic.
Yes, we have a couple of questions here.
Okay.
The first one actually is about licensing, so let me pop that up. Do you have to provide an enterprise edition license for Azure when you're setting up one of these managed instances or SQL database?
Um, I was never able, actually, let me also say this. I was never actually able to do that because the only exposure that I have to Azure is using my Visual Studio $50 a month subscription. And I apologize that I can't fully answer that, but because I don't have any licenses that I've been able to take with me, I'm not really sure.
Okay.
I do think that it would have to be an enterprise license in order to take it over there. But you would have to get with the licensing expert to address that one.
That is fair. The other question that we have in chat, how would you handle external processes that transform data, like business to business work, where we may have SFTP that's receiving data, and then usually that'll be kicked off from a SQL agent job to go out and grab the data and do whatever processing.
For us as a company, we use Informatica, and we use Tableau kind of for our reporting. And so we have EC2 instances that are managing the workflow processes that are doing our ETL type stuff. So obviously we're able to capture that data, we're able to push and pull to that particular SQL server or multiple SQL servers using that third-party tool. Again, can't fully speak to Azure, but I would assume that it would be similar in that you probably could, with the EC2 or with virtual machines, set up a virtual machine instance where you own it. You have control over those services. So, you can buy EC2 instance, or you can buy virtual machines where the license is included. And, again, since you kind of own that machine, you can install those services. I know that you could do that within AWS instances, but I'm assuming you could also do it similarly with Azure instances. But that, you can control it using that sort of third-party virtual machine to go back and forth between your databases, where they could also be the platform as a service type instances.
Yeah, and I'll say on the Azure side, actually on both sides, a lot of this stuff wouldn't necessarily be in the SQL Server world, that you may create AWS Lambda functions or Azure functions to do a lot of the code processing. But you're right, a VM that's running SQL agent could work as well. Or Azure Automation exists, and I'm pretty sure AWS has some sort of equivalent of a scheduled task that runs.
Yeah, they do.
So,
Yeah. So I think that answers the question.
let's see. Variation. Reading the question, it just came in. Not sure if this was
Okay.
mentioned or not, but you're mentioning additions and versions, but the only variations that are shown are editions, like Web, Standard, Express, Enterprise.
Well, when
Is
I say version, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish the question. I apologize.
is it possible to choose the version in the various offerings, like 2014, 2016, 2017?
Well, again, with AWS, uh, once you choose your edition, then you actually can choose the version, which that was in some of the first drop downs. With Azure, you can choose the database compatibility on the database itself, but you can't choose any sort of a version on the instance itself. So it will always be SQL Azure as the level for the server or for the instance. But again, then you would set at the database level your compatibility.
Great, thank you. I think
Okay.
all the questions for the moment.
Okay. Well, we'll move on to our next topic. So let's talk about kind of, again, backup and restore. So with AWS RDS, it supports native backup and restore for databases, but not in the normal way that we're used to doing it. We're used to seeing a backup, you go create your backup statement, backup log, however, and then you kind of, in the messages tab, you start seeing your 5, 10, 15, 20% going, whatever instance level you set it at as far as notification of it. But with AWS RDS, they have locked down a lot of the master processes and stored procedures and MSDB system store procedures. So the way that we do it is not the same. What is required is essentially 3 services. With AWS, you have what are called, it's their blob storage called S3, and you create, essentially the terminology is buckets, but you create these storage devices. Your storage buckets is what we call them, and then you also have to have an identity and access management role. And then the third thing is that you would actually set up through what's called an option group with an RDS. You set up the ability to back up and restore to a particular RDS instance, and then AWS has created. It's funny, they've created within the MSDB database their own RDS functions. So they are still maintaining a lot of that backup history and stuff within the system tables that are so integral to the MSDB database as far as backup history and things of that nature. But the way that you have to back up is you issue these backup commands. You tell it the database, you tell it the bucket or the storage device that you're wanting to go to send it into, and you give it the file name. And a restore is very much the same way. You simply go in and issue a restore command, and it'll restore it from that particular location onto the particular database that you're issuing the restore command from. But again, this is where it's a little bit more difficult, because essentially what happens is when you issue the command, it'll immediately come back and tell you that command has completed successfully. But essentially what it's doing is it's kind of like a scheduled task. It's putting this request for backup, and it runs in the background. So in order to kind of see where the status of these particular backups is, you would have to then go in and do this RDS task status, and you can literally just call the store procedure without any parameter, and it'll bring back the complete list of statuses. But essentially what's happening is, again, it's sort of like queued. So you'll see up here that this particular database back in December that we were backing up, it took 21 minutes to back up. It was successful. You'll see an example down here that there was an error on a database. It ran for 8 minutes and then it errored out, for any various number of reasons. And so automating this for us has become, it's been somewhat difficult to automate, because one of the things, as I was telling you guys, we use SQL Standard on a lot of our production servers, but we have Web Edition on some of our development servers. And so 4 of our largest servers, we do backups on those particular servers into an S3 bucket, and then we restore them on 1 or 2 development servers, rather than having to have the same equal number of development servers that we have for our standard production servers. So it just allows us to minimize cost. But this was one of those things that it took us a while to try to figure out how we would automate this through a script. And so we really have not been able to find a clean way to automate this, because essentially what we were doing was we would go in and sort of use a while loop on a stored procedure, and that while loop or script, however we were doing it, would then have to go in and we'd literally use a wait for delay and say, go run for a minute, and then go back in and read the last record for this database. Is the life cycle a success? And has the percentage reached 100? And then we could go grab the backup location, and then we could go to our other server and start a restore statement. So I mean, it's been a bit of a challenge. And so essentially what we have done is we really have no clean way of doing this. So we've kind of scripted this out. So the backups kick off on, say, a Friday night, and on a Saturday, we have on a separate server, we have some restore scripts that essentially, that way we're not having to try to manage these backup times, because these backups vary based on current activity on our servers. Our largest database could take 2 hours to back up, but it could go as high as 3.5 based on how busy the server is. So we've kind of separated our backup and restores across a couple of different boxes, using a mixture of, maybe we have a virtual machine that kind of does some scheduled tasks and just uses command line SQL. or we've also got it in some smaller places where we are using SQL agent. So we can issue the backup command on one server, and then on another server, we'll issue the restore commands through the SQL agent. So anyway, a little odd in the way that we've had to handle some of those backups, but essentially that's how you back up your individual databases. SQL on AWS, because it's a sort of an entire instance, it is similar to a managed instance in that you can have multiple databases on the same instance within RDS. So when you're doing backups within RDS, you're doing instance level backups. And so SQL Server is backing up the entire, you can almost think of it as like a VM backup. I mean, it's a snapshot. It's literally a snapshot of a given time of a particular server. Now, this has been a really good thing for us. In one instance, one of our largest servers, we have a day-old copy of that server. And so rather than having to go get the backup out of the S3 bucket, or like we used to do on-prem, we literally had to go make sure that the backup was in the file folder and restore from that particular backup, and then run some additional scripts. And that process took about 8 hours to get the day-old server ready for reporting and data warehousing. Since we're doing everything at a instance level, we can literally take a snapshot of our largest server where we want a day-old copy and take an hour to back it up, and then a little bit later in the night, initiate like through a Jenkins job or some automated fashion to actually apply that snapshot and put it to another instance, and we now have a day-old copy. And with AWS, we can also change our instances as far as size level. So let's say that our current one is that 16 core with 122 gigabytes. Maybe we want to make this reporting copy 64 gigabyte with 8 cores. So we can change the size that the snapshot gets applied to save costs on money and things of that nature. But essentially, we can do that instance level snapshot and do a restore of it. It also has the ability to control deletion. So we can protect an instance from somebody going in and arbitrarily deleting it or accidentally deleting it within the portal by script or by actually using the AWS portal. But if you have permissions, you can go in and drop a database. So I don't know about you guys, but one of the things that's always I've always struggled with is sometimes I'll go take some tables of a database, trying to combine them to just create a test that I want to do, maybe spend an hour or two developing a test database. And then I'll delete it. And then all of a sudden I'm thinking, oh, shoot, I needed to rerun that. And if I didn't back it up, I got to restart the whole process. So, as long as you've backed it up, the individual databases, and that's, again, you have to do the backup and restore or the backup statements into the S3 buckets. Otherwise, you'd have to restore an entire instance and then back up the database and then restore the database to another one. So again, you just have to be aware that at an AWS level, you have to back up your individual databases if you're wanting that control. Otherwise, you can be fine just backing up your entire instance. Also, with an S3 bucket, you do have the ability to control policies and retention on the different backups. So, if this particular bucket, you're needing to set it up to keep copies for 12 months, you can do that. Whereas this other one, you can set it up to keep it at 30 days, different things of that nature. So when you look at Azure SQL DB, and again, some of these similarities exist between a SQL DB instance and a managed instance, but there are some differences. So with an Azure SQL DB, it does not support native backup and restore. You can't do it at all. It's self-managed. So the backups are automatically backed up at the database level. Excuse me, I got a cough here for a second. And So you can easily, once you throw a database out there into Azure, it will start backing up that database. You also have the ability to configure your policies for retention at an individual backup level. Restoring a database is also very easy. You simply go in and restore from the portal, and you can restore. You cannot restore a database over itself. You could restore it to another database with a new name. And then this is a thing that I think is kind of cool with Azure that you don't have with AWS. If I go delete a database, I can actually restore that deleted database. So back to that example I was giving where I spend, an hour or two creating a sample database to play around with for something. If I were to delete it, then it actually becomes available to me here for a time so that I can actually then go in and restore it and reuse it. With the Azure Portal, you do have the ability to create locks on your databases to protect your database. And the locks are for like read only and delete, so you can keep people from deleting your different databases. However, that does not work if a drop command is issued. So the ability to lock and protect a database is only within the Azure Portal, which I think that's kind of a bad thing if your user has permission to actually go in and drop the database. But again, you do have that deleted database screen so that you can go in and restore that database if you needed to. Now, with a managed instance, it does support full database copy-only backups, but it does not support differential or log backups. So that is a big difference. And if you're going to back up from the managed instance, you have to use a URL option. So that is how you're going to take a backup of the database and actually put it to blob storage. And the same thing is true also, since you can issue the backup command and you can also issue the restore command, you can also use that restore command with URL, because that's how you access it, is by URL. It does do automatic backups at the database level as well. And again, you can also set your retention policies on those particular databases. And you can also restore it to an instance or to a different instance. Doesn't have to be to the same instance it's from, as long as it has access. And you also, again, still have the ability to restore a deleted database. Same thing applies on a managed instance as it does on the individual SQL database. You can create your locks and your read-on through the portal itself, but they do not apply on a drop command. So just something for you to be aware of. And again, I kind of was just playing around with that one day and didn't realize that until I actually issued the drop command and I lost it. So again, just kind of reiterating, with backup and restore, you have the ability to do native backup and restores within AWS, but you have to realize that the automatic backups is at the instance level, not the databases themselves. So if you're wanting to do backups just on your databases for moving databases around, restoring databases to different servers, that is a managed process that you have to do manually, in terms of you have to set up your backup schedules. And we use SQL Agent to do a lot of our backups to those buckets. But we have to set those up. We have to manage and make sure that they've run, different things of that nature. So, but with Azure SQL DB and with Azure managed instances, you can do your backups and restores on the managed instance, but it's from the blob storage. But you do have automatic database backups. And again, you can restore a dropped database through the deleted databases screen. I should change that. I need to change that text. It says can restore dropped. I meant you can restore a deleted database from the backups that are done. So those are kind of some of the differences with backup and restore. Do we have any questions, Kevin, from this area?
It looks like the answer is no questions right now.
Okay. Well, then we will move forward to our third topic. So let's talk about monitoring. So with AWS, there are built-in monitoring tools. The first is called CloudWatch. This is a native AWS tool. It is more at the instance level, so you can kind of think of it as being. This is a very loose interpretation, but similar to the performance monitor, where you can go in and get non-SQL counters and view what's going on with your server, as well as those SQL counters to actually look at some of your SQL functionality. So this is similar. I think there's about 50 different metrics, if I remember correctly, that you can get with RDS instances. But you can look at some of your I/O and your disk and storage metrics, as well as some of the database metrics. Last year, I believe it was last year, they also introduced a new management tool called Performance Insights. And so this is more truly database centric, but with AWS, it is somewhat of an agnostic tool, meaning Performance Insights will work for Oracle, will work for MySQL, will work for SQL Server, will work for Postgres. The screens obviously look different based on what you're looking at, but you can quickly see over here in the right-hand corner, these weights. So this is kind of very similar, though, to what we're used to looking at in some of the different monitoring solutions, third-party monitoring solutions that might be related to your weight stats. And so this is, again, sort of just some examples. You can go look at individual SQL statements, individual hosts, users, what's taking up the most in resources and time. AWS also has built-in alerts, and so you can do different things based on those alerts. And with AWS, this to me seems a real step backwards. With RDS, you cannot use extended events to monitor your servers. You have to use SQL Profiler. And again, part of that is because of the way that they've locked down the master database and the MSDB database, but also you don't have access to the file system within an RDS. It's lighter generally over Profiler. Now with Azure SQL DB, there's native built-in tools within the Azure Portal. The thing that I like about these tools is, again, I've not really spent any time within Azure looking at anything other than SQL Server. So I can't really speak to how the screens change based on if I'm looking at a web server versus looking at a virtual machine and such. But when I'm looking at my SQL Server screens for monitoring, the thing that I like here is that I'm on one screen. I'm not having to deal with going over here to look at CloudWatch to look at the instance metrics, and then going over here to the Performance Insights and looking at the SQL metrics. The native portal screens seem to be much more in tune with looking at SQL Server as a whole, even instance level information on that given server or instance that I'm managing. Azure SQL DB also has alerts. Excuse me. And again, this is just sort of giving, you have the ability with the graphs to go in and look at different metrics across multiple servers, but I can go in and make graphs based on time and analysis of my particular servers with the portal tools. Now with Azure SQL DB, you do use extended events, but one key difference is on an event, you're used to using the on server clause, but with Azure SQL DB, you have to use the on database clause because you don't have access to the server. And you cannot use Profiler with Azure SQL DB because you're stuck at that single instance of Azure SQL DB. You don't have access to master and things of that nature. Now, with an Azure managed instance, same portal tools. So a nice thing is you're not having to look at different sort of a different idea with a managed instance versus single database instance. Again, similar screens looking at different metrics related to the instance. It also, just as Azure SQL DB, supports alerts so that you can do different things based on those alerts. You can also use extended events with Azure SQL DB, or I'm sorry, with an Azure managed instance. But again, you're writing that information to blob storage. So it's a little bit different in the way that you would do your Azure, your extended events on a managed instance. Don't really have any information beyond that, but you can go in and research that. You can also use Profiler on a managed instance. So you have the ability to do both if you needed it. Now, with third party, these are obviously not the full extent of third-party tools that support SQL Server, but I think they're some of the most popular. You'll notice that on this list, Redgate is not an option. As to date, as I understand it, Redgate does not support AWS RDS instances. It fully supports virtual machines, but from what I know, Redgate does not support using RDS instances for SQL Server. But with Azure SQL DB and managed instances, you do have the ability through all four of these vendors and more to do third-party monitoring. And again, those are just links to the different articles that talk about using those platforms. So again, for monitoring, each portal has their own built-in tools. But with Azure, you have the ability to use extended events, whereas with AWS, you're kind of forced to have to use Profiler at this time. But I think in general, there tends to be more support for the Azure platforms with third parties than there does with AWS. And I think part of that is because you have to think about when you spin up an AWS instance, it's full-blown SQL Server. But they've locked it down so that you can't access master, you can't access MSDB to some degrees. I can go into the system tables. I can query tables within the MSDB database. It's not that I don't have access to the database, but they've locked out some of the system functionality that we're used to as administrators to those databases, so that I think these third-party tools don't have the access that they need to the server that they're used to. So the way that an instance works in RDS is, some of your third-party can't really write and read from it the same way that it's used to when it's on-prem. So, that's just kind of an overview of doing some of the monitoring. Do we have any questions related to monitoring?
Yes, we had a question that was, how does SQL agent jobs work on RDS if there's no access to MSDB?
Well, you do have limited access. As I said, you have access to the MSDB in some form and fashion. You have the ability to use SQL agent, but for example, you can't use system alerts. You can't use DB mail. You can't use operators, which those are things that are within the MSDB database. So there is some functionality that you have. You can use SQL agent, but you don't have full access the way you're used to on-prem.
Okay, makes sense. I think that was the only question for the moment.
Okay. All right.
Oh, sorry,
Well,
there's one more that just came in. Came in at
go
the
ahead.
deadline. How would messaging be supported, or how would you suggest handling messaging?
Yeah, that's the hard part for us, because we used DB mail a lot with our on-prem servers. So what we have essentially done is we use SolarWinds as our monitoring solution, and part of that is because we are a very large. We have a very large mixture. We have MySQL, Postgres, and SQL Server. And because we didn't want to have a separate monitoring solution for SQL Server and then another monitoring solution for any of the other platforms, we've just used SolarWinds, which, well, I could get into likes and dislikes, and I won't do that. But essentially what we have is we have actually set our SQL Server monitoring solution on an instance, a virtual instance running in our office. So we actually have moved, because we can do some of that alerting through our third-party monitoring. We have set up SolarWinds and alerts coming from SolarWinds on that on-prem instance. So you could kind of do the same sort of thing with a virtual machine, but other than maybe creating some PowerShells and somehow or another, another thing that we sometimes do with some of our instances is we actually have some virtual machines that do nothing but job servers for a lot of our different build tasks and things like that we might do on our platforms. And so you might be able to set up, and it does messaging off of those systems within PowerShell and different things like that. So you're probably going to have to be creative and look at different ways to do your messaging, because you don't really have that through your RDS instances. And unfortunately, and I don't really have any workaround other than some of the things that I've mentioned that we've had to use. With AWS, obviously with a managed instance, you have access to SQL agent, you have access to operators and DB mail and all that sort of stuff. You don't, obviously, with Azure SQL DB. So, the other thing to think about is you've also got your alerts through, which doesn't give you the best solution, but from an alerting perspective, you can set up alerts within your different portals for system alerts on, resource usage being too high and different things like that, which a lot of times we're used to using, at least in part, some of the SQL alerts that are kind of built into SQL Server. So anyway, I apologize that I don't have any better solution than that, but that's really where we've had to go is placing them on a third-party system somewhere else beyond these RDS instances.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
No, I think those were the questions.
Okay, well, we'll move on to patch management. This one's one of the smaller nuggets. So with patch management, as we all know, over the last couple of years, Microsoft has moved from your large service packs to doing everything by cumulative update. And as we all know, they have not always gotten those cumulative updates right. You'll see on my screen some sort of between updates that have had to be applied between different cumulative updates. We just had one with cumulative update 2 for SQL Server. It basically made SQL Agent stop running. And they've had to issue cumulative update 3, and cumulative update 4 recently just came out as well. So they, sometimes they don't get the security, the patches right, but that's the model, is that they're now moving everything to cumulative updates. So within RDS, you have the ability to choose which patch level you want to put at. If you remember that first screen that I showed you, rather than blinding you guys and flipping all the way back to some of those first screens that I did, you had the ability to choose, do you want a particular cumulative level update when you're starting an instance of SQL Server? All of our servers, we do not do any automatic patching, which is kind of what this screen down here is showing you. Auto minor version upgrades on your database instances. Everything that we have is set to no as a model, because, for example, with MySQL, we've had sometimes that the drivers have updated and code no longer works on our current MySQL instances because some patch was applied. And so we've turned everything off to no, we don't want any system updates unless we initiate it. So I actually had to test and explore with this a little bit with RDS. So with RDS, what you do is you set up your maintenance window, and then based on that maintenance window, if there's an update, it'll go in and apply that update. So since we haven't really tested it with RDS on SQL Server, I decided, well, let me go launch an instance and try it. So I created an instance of SQL 2017. I think I was like at maybe patch level CU13, set up the maintenance window. And after the maintenance window, I was expecting to see it update. Well, lo and behold, it didn't update. So as I was going in and looking at documentation, all of a sudden, auto minor version upgrade, it's not supported for SQL Server on RDS. So the bottom line is with SQL Server in RDS, you are having to manually manage your patching. So it's easy. You simply go pick your version that you want to apply and reboot the machine, and it'll take care of doing it. But if you don't have failover, so for example, we have 4 SQL Standard editions, and they're larger editions or larger servers. 2 of those we have failover on, and 2 of them we don't. So we just recently went from CU13 to CU16 being the highest patch level that is currently supported with RDS. And so we had to plan. So those servers that do not have failover, it literally took about a 15-minute level. It applied the patch, restarted the machine, everything came back up. Now, what tended to happen was we didn't lose connectivity right away when we applied the patch. It would apply the patch in the background, and then it would initiate. But again, it was about a 15-minute downtime that we had to plan on. But with our failover instances, it literally was a 30 to 60-second hiccup. And so although we had to monitor it and watch it because there was a failover, excuse me, because there was a failover, that blip was very minor. So what we've actually started to do on systems that we deem too critical to allow any downtime, what we have actually done is we will go in and we will initiate a failover copy or create that secondary copy and let it create that secondary copy so we have failover. Then we will go in and apply patching. And then once the patching is done, because we had that failover, we had a very small window of outage. And then once that patching is done, we would actually then go turn off failover so that you no longer had that failover option. So you're literally talking maybe a 2 to 4 hour window as it's making that instance copy of your SQL Server in order to do your patching. So that is, again, it's a feature that we wouldn't have been able to really do if we were on-prem, but now with in the cloud, we have the ability to do that and minimize some of our downtime. It's just a hit from a cost perspective because we're having to make that second copy. Now, with Azure SQL DB and Azure Managed Instances, there literally is no patching, nothing that you have to do. It is taken care of for you by Microsoft. Now, I'm not gonna sell it. I'm not gonna oversell it that it's a magic bullet because I have heard some people tell me when their systems were patched. I think like the master account, they got locked out for the time that the system was being patched, or there were some performance hits during those times that they were being patched. And as I am aware of, there's no control over when those patches get applied on a scheduling basis. I may be wrong about that, but again, I'm dealing with a $50 a month subscription to Azure, And let me just tell you, go try to run a managed instance on $50 and you won't have it for very long. It's not cheap to run a managed instance, and you don't get very far with $50 on a managed instance. So, um, so anyway, so this was an interesting article that I found on Azure SQL DB. Again, you think about it, Azure is owned by Microsoft, SQL Server is owned by Microsoft. They have created a way that in some instances, they can literally patch the server while it's in active memory. So they can literally update certain pieces of memory with these hot patching on Azure. And it's amazing to me how they are able to do that. It's a rather technical article, but it's just kind of an interesting read if you want to go read about it sometime. So again, patching is pretty easy from Azure perspective. There's not really a whole lot you do. It's taken care of, and it's not hard with RDS. You just have to remember it is manual. You have to control applying those patches to your instances, but you have some options that you might not have had when you were on-prem. So some interesting stuff. So any questions as they relate to patching?
None that I see so far.
Okay. Yeah, it's been really nice for us to be able to do that instance pull up, you know, and be able to minimize some of the downtime on our production servers because of that. So, all right, well, we'll go on to our next topic, our last topic, which is PowerPoint. So again, if you guys have spent much time in PowerPoint, you know, for me, a lot of what I do with PowerPoint is I'd use the sort of object instance level through the file system. So I'll go in and create my PS drive so that I can go in and do some different automations on different objects within AWS, or I'm sorry, within a SQL Server instance. And so what I did was I just tried to show you guys some different screens showing what happens when you would try to go through the sort of the file system drive perspective on the different objects of an AWS instance. So you know, you can see that I can see my logins. I can see some of my tables within a given database. And then, you know, here you're starting to see, well, I can get to my job server, but then all of a sudden, as I start getting down here and try to get to the operators on my given job server, now all of a sudden I'm getting errors. So that's basically where I was trying to tell you that with RDS instances, you have access to the SQL agent, but there are certain parts of it that you can't. And so you just have to kind of look at it and play with it as you go in and test using SQL agent on your different instances. Now, if you're familiar with the DBA tools, you know, I mentioned it at the beginning of our session. You know, the DBA tools is an entire suite of functions and scripts that have been put together by it's open source, but put together by some really, really smart and intelligent people for automation of PowerShell and SQL Server. If you don't know about it, I highly encourage you to check them out. They're really, really helpful, and some over 500 current functions that they're using for automation with SQL Server. But these are just some examples. So, you know, going in and making connection to the server, running a last backup statement, getting that information about the backup on a particular database, going in and doing a test compression to see what does it recommend for my index compression. With RDS, with AWS, they've created their own set of tools for PowerShell, but these really are going to be more at an instance level. So you're not really going to be interacting with the SQL Server, you know, and the different objects on the SQL Server, like your databases and logins and such. So you just have to kind of think about this more from an instance level. But we do use these within our Jenkins jobs and different things like that for automation of server rebuilds, server refreshes, different things of that nature. Now with Azure SQL DB, again, taking the same sort of approach, I went in to see what would I have access to if I set up my drive, file system drive to that server. So I have the ability to go in and look at my logins. I have the ability to look at my tables within a given database. But then when you try to go into your job server, wham, you don't have access to anything related to SQL Agent or your job server under a SQL managed instance, because again, you're dealing with a single database instance. You don't have access to anything else other than that database. And then same thing with the DBA tools. I did similar statements with those. And so some things will work. Some of the DBA tool functions that you run will work. Some of them won't, because again, it's based on what databases, what functions is it trying to actually access, what objects on the server is it trying to access. And so it'll limit you based on what you're trying to run, but you'll just have to go in and test it. And obviously, PowerShell was created by Microsoft, so they obviously have built their own modules to support PowerShell. I think there's a stronger support for PowerShell on Azure than there is on AWS, just within kind of what we're used to using. And with a managed instance, the same sort of file system idea. So if I'm going to go in and connect to the server like it's a file system, what is my access to those particular instances? And then you obviously automatically see right now, I'm starting to look at my different operators on a given database. I'm looking at a job that I set up on a particular database. So, you have much more access to all those SQL objects that you're used to using if you do this way on your on-premise type scripts. And the same thing with the DBA tools. With the DBA tools, you have the same sort of functionality that you would have with an on-prem, because a lot of that same functionality is there. You just have to provide your instance that you're trying to connect to. Now, with the DBA tools, or I'm sorry, I'll get to that in just a second. So I included an extra link here just because it talks about using PowerShell for creating and managing a managed instance. So I just thought that article might be helpful to anyone that might pull up the PDF of the document, of the slide deck, and you have access to that. With the DBA tools, back, I think it was December last year, I was in a webinar that was being run by SQL Century or Century One. And one of the topics that was covered was the DBA tools, and a couple of the creators or key contributors were part of the session. And one of the questions was asked about how to use the PowerShell automation tools in the DBA tools suite for RDS, AWS RDS instances. And I just thought that this really, the majority of the people in the DBA tools community really work with Azure. So I think you will find that the DBA tools, although some things might not work on Azure SQL DB type instances, from a managed instance perspective, I think there's going to be a much broader support for the DBA tools to work under Azure as opposed to working under an RDS instance, because that's just kind of the way that they've designed it. So again, just some key points. PowerShell is supported on all the platforms, but your scripting management objects, I think you have more support for those PS Drive scripting or SQL management objects through RDS, because you kind of have more servers or more objects that you can access. Whereas on an Azure SQL DB, you're limited to those objects within that given database. But again, SQL management objects is much more supported on a managed instance than either two of the other instances. And then again, I think the DBA tools work on all the different platforms. I think they work best on a managed instance. But if you're going to be an RDS, you just have to kind of test what is going to work on my DBA tools as on a RDS instance as opposed to an Azure instance. So any questions as it relates to PowerShell?
We'll see if any of the questions come in. Now, I'm going to call out someone who I saw lurking in here earlier, who is actually one of the contributors to to DBA tools, Andy Levy. So
Okay.
I saw him somewhere at some point, but I'm not going to call you out. If you're still listening, you don't have to say anything here, Andy. Looks like no questions.
During that session that I was making reference to, Christy, if I'm saying her name right, Lemaire.
Chrissy Lemaire, yep.
Lemaire, she was part of that, and I actually issued some questions to her about AWS and using the tools, and she told me that if I could create some scripts to try to send to her, she could maybe play around a little bit, and we could start to see maybe how. And I tried to spend a little time doing that, but time got away from me. I haven't been able to do it for several months. But I'm hoping at some point that they might broaden it a little bit. But I think what it really will come down to is somebody who uses AWS getting involved, or those that use AWS getting more involved in contributing.
Oh, that's an important part of it, absolutely.
Well, that kind of wraps up all the topics. So let me just finish up with basically, if I had my druthers, who would I choose? And first and foremost, I'm going to choose what my company chooses because, we have, as a company, we have been in AWS for several years with web servers and different applications and things of that nature. So it really made a economic sense for us to go to AWS rather than trying to create some sort of a hybrid solution. But at this point, after spending so much time trying to research and look at how you do things within both platforms, if I really had to choose, I really would give. And if my weight, if weight was given to my topic, my consideration and my input, I really would strongly push Azure. And I've got some specific reasons why. And I think the very first one is just the licensing. It is insane to me how much running SQL Server on other platforms is going to cost in the future, as opposed to using Azure. With the whole license mobility and software assurance, I really think that Microsoft is going to kind of stick it to a lot of these other vendors, and in some regards, I think they already are. I didn't really talk about it much, but I really the one of the things that I like about Azure is that it gets the new features for SQL Server before you get on-prem. And again, I made reference to this, but when you run SQL Server as an RDS instance on AWS, it's really no different than running on-prem. It is a full-blown 100% compatible SQL Server, but they just have locked out certain features. And so, you're still not going to get any new features in RDS that you would get on-prem because they're essentially coming out at the same time. But with Azure, you're actually getting new instances, new features such as automatic tuning. We've got databases that haven't been touched in several years. They're small databases, and it would be nice to allow SQL Server to maybe create those new indexes. It's not perfect. It's not really any different than the missing indexes, but it is nice to know that they have the opportunity to do some improvements when it might be a system that we don't touch in a while. And same thing for deleting indexes. Those are some of the options available for automatic tuning. So I like the ability to look and investigate some of these new features with Azure that I don't get if I'm on-prem or if I'm in another vendor, another cloud provider. And I really do like the automatic patching. We don't patching. My job from an administrator standpoint is a lot easier being in RDS. So I'm glad to be in the cloud. But I like having more up-to-date patching. I won't say it's it's always the best to go to the newest, but many times they make improvements, add new features with those patches. Sometimes you see performance gains when those patches are applied because they make improvements. And so I like the automatic patching that you get with Azure. Again, I think there's stronger SQL support or PowerShell support. I apologize. And so I just think that I would do more PowerShell with Azure, especially the DBA tools. And I'm really a big fan, even though I don't use it because of cost. And my company is in AWS, not in Azure. It really seems like everything I'm reading, what limited exposure I've had to using, a managed instance is one of the easiest ways to go from on-prem into SQL Server from a consideration standpoint. So I really like a managed instance, but again, limited exposure. So take that with a grain of salt. And then this last one, it's very specific, but I just kind of like the Azure Portal better than I do the AWS. One example of that is, I like the ability to create my own dashboards with Azure. Let's say that I'm responsible for an application as well as the database. I could go add my web servers, I could go ask my caching servers, I can go add my SQL Server and all my different resources that relate to that application on one dashboard. And I'm not having to go look at my EC2 or virtual instance, and then I have to run over and look at my SQL instance. And I kind of have everything there, or I can design everything. And I haven't seen any way to do that within the AWS portal itself. So there are just things I like better about the Azure portal over the AWS portal that I haven't really seen the ability to do that in AWS. So last couple of slides just kind of provide you some informational links. This third link is a really interesting article. I would encourage you to go read it. Obviously, Microsoft does a really good job marketing how much better they are from a cost perspective on Azure as opposed to AWS or some other cloud provider from a cost perspective. But this is a third-party article about running virtual machines within Azure as opposed to AWS. And actually, they show that AWS has better performance and better cost than Azure. Now, that may no longer be true because that was done back in 2018. But again, there's just a lot of different articles out there and a lot of different vendors that's worth spending time on looking at to see what how do the systems really compare. So again, just a lot of informational links as they talk about using managed instances and your different options with high availability and such. And one other point I did want to make, and I didn't really say this in the licensing part that we talked about earlier in the session. Even though those changes in licensing came about when SQL 2019 was released, as I have read, all those changes apply to any current mainstream version of SQL Server from 2012 through 2019. So if you have software assurance on your servers, again, talk to licensing experts, But as I understand it, you can start to actually do DBCC checks on those passive copies, not just in SQL 2019, but within those SQL 2012 through 2019 versions. So just a lot to really explore with the changes in software assurance and license mobility there. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to let me go over this presentation and share it with you. If there's any other questions, I would also be open to if anybody has any comments. Maybe somebody has some experience with Azure that maybe something I said wasn't true, wasn't right. Certainly would love to hear that correction, because obviously I'm not an expert on Azure, as I'm not an avid user of it. So.
We do have a couple of questions in chat. The
Okay.
first one is, do you know of any tools to review existing workloads and get an idea of your estimated price or plan to migrate from on-premises to either Azure or to AWS?
I know that there are some tools. I would have to research it. It seems like I remember hearing some price calculators, and I may be wrong in this. Kevin, you might know this. You may know the DBA tools suite better than I do, but it seems like I had something in my head where I remember reading about where they were creating something within the DBA tools that might help with workload analysis on Azure cost. Maybe completely off base on that. I don't remember why I have that in my head. Maybe I dreamed it.
So I know that both of them definitely have all of their pricing information publicly
Right.
available. The downside is that you have to understand the specific details of, oh, you need to have, in addition to the compute, you also need to include the storage and the
Right.
network bandwidth. But don't worry, it's only this kind of network bandwidth. But then you also have to include, like, if you're backing up to S3, the cost of S3 storage. So
Right. Yeah, now that's one thing I will say with the AWS screens, as you're going through and creating your instance, some of that stuff is, so when you get the price, you've filled some of that stuff out with the wizard as you're doing it. Um, so you're not having to deal with seeing a price for your compute resource and then a separate price for your storage and a separate price for this or that. So I do think the screens in AWS are a little bit easier with that. I think with Azure, where they have the old model of DTU as opposed to the vCore, I think the vCore pricing is better, but I think it makes it a little bit more difficult because the DTU is kind of the all-inclusive. From what I know, was the all-inclusive, database, storage, compute, IOP measurement. But yeah, you definitely, there's, the devil is in the details, and you do have to spend a lot of time knowing your workload, knowing what you're going to do, and I highly encourage you to look at doing reserved instances, and I believe that's what it's called with Azure as well. But where you're doing your pricing ahead of time, you're making a commitment, but the cost savings can be phenomenal.
yeah, and on the Azure side, there is, in addition, I'm furiously Googling this, trying to find the name of it, but there is a tool that will allow you to run a server assessment locally against your on-prem instances and
Right.
give you an idea of what the CPU utilization is, and so what kind of, like, if you were migrating to a VM, what kinds of things that you would have.
Is it database migration assistant?
It might be Data Migration Assistant. I'm blanking on the actual name.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about now.
But that is a thing. And there's also a different tool that's built into SQL Server Management Studio that allows you to say, this database, is there anything that I'm using which is not supported in Azure SQL Database? So that's
Right, and that same tool that you're talking about, if it's the one I'm remembering, it has that same sort of a review. You know, if you've got a 2012 and you want to migrate it to a 2017 Azure, it'll actually tell you, you know, these are, for example, you're using this particular feature in a store procedure, and you might want to at least be aware there's some things you might want to change before you actually do the migration.
Yeah, that's Data Migration Assistant. Several people in chat
Okay.
are saying, "Yep, yep, yep." But I think there's a different tool that does capacity, and I
Okay.
cannot remember what the name is. I just read something about it today and yesterday, and yet my brain has completely lost it. Nonetheless, there are things available.
Right. And but honestly, nobody saves money going to the cloud. I mean, I say that obviously. I just they might save money over the long haul, because you're not plopping everything down for a complete on-prem server, you know, refresh in your on-prem environment. But you know, if you don't manage it well, the cloud is not going to be a cheaper solution.
It's funny you mentioned that because the next question I was going to ask was, has anyone ever really reduced cost while running on AWS? And
Um, Again, I think um, we did. All right. I obviously am not a I'm not one of the financial people, as it relates to us in our department. I'm part of a team of 3 DBAs at Cafepress. Um, so I don't really necessarily get into some of the cost aspects, but our data center in Vegas was costing us $750,000 to $1 million a year to do. And so, you know, when we went to AWS, we were looking at cost savings, um, but I can't tell you what that has been, um, just because I'm not privy to that information. But at the same time, I would also say that we went from a SQL Enterprise box with 390 gig of RAM and, you know, a SAN backed system to RDS instances, and we went from enterprise to standard. And so, yeah, we've had some difficulties, and if we probably did a cost to cost equal to equal level, we might not have ended up saving any money. It may have costed us more money, but um, I do think, if it's done well, you can at least stage it over multiple years. Um, and at the same time, I don't think you, again, just speaking from a lower level, not one of the ones that's privy to the financial information, but I think you can do it from a similar cost perspective as you average it out over, because it's taken a lot of years for me to really, or a lot of months for me to really realize when you're looking at an on-prem, you have electricity, you have air conditioning, you have all your cooling, I mean, so there's a lot of costs, and it's hard to put those to an actual value, but you have to try to do that so that you can do some sort of an apples to apples comparison between a cloud provider where you're paying all that in the hourly fee.
yeah, and throwing in my 2 cents on this, the short answer is that yes, you obviously can save money in the cloud. Um, it is not easy, and if you expect to take your existing applications and just run them as is, you're going to spend a lot more money in the cloud.
Right. It's
Uh,
planning. Planning's key.
exactly. It's things like turning application code that needs to run on dedicated VMs into smaller functions, using more asynchronous processes, so using message passing instead of having databases that live and constantly acquire data. It's a slightly different world. And point was made of capex versus opex, where one's easier to sell at certain times than the other. So that
Right.
could be a consideration. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we saw because we had been dealing with years of some applications, parts of our applications being in the cloud and our database servers being on-prem, there was a natural slow latency. And once we actually moved everything to the cloud, we actually got much lower latencies and higher throughput that we weren't getting because we were sort of that hybrid solution. So, I mean, in some ways, it was a good trade-off, but yeah, I mean, it takes time and planning.
yeah. Next question in here is, do you think that Azure SQL Database will supersede SQL Server?
Ooh, I don't know. There is just, I mean, for us, speaking from my experience, one of the most important things. Some people frown on it, some don't. Um, we do a lot of cross database queries, and for us, we could not do Azure SQL DB instances because that would just be it is horrible to try to do cross database queries with your different um, single instance DBs. Um, I could see where in some instances it might supersede SQL Server because they're pushing cloud so hard. They're pushing all the new features there. Um, but I think it's a great solution for a lot of for maybe some small type applications. And again, speaking from my experience,
Yeah.
um, it's nice to be able to just quickly throw a single database up there for a website um, that's not having to go be across three other databases, and it's smaller. Um, so it may be more of a niche solution.
Right. So I'll throw in my answer here. Azure SQL Database has a lot of the same code base as SQL Server on premises or SQL Server IaaS, whatever. So Microsoft is adamant that both editions will be around. Both of these things will still be around. That they are actively working on both of them. There are use cases for both of them. So I would not be concerned about SQL Server going away and being replaced strictly by having to use the Azure SQL Database Platform as a Service option alone.
Yeah. And honestly, technology is constantly changing. I mean, look at mainframes with central processing and your terminals, and then we went back to PCs, and now we're in the cloud. And what's going to happen when some key data center that's part of AWS or Azure completely craters, and now all of a sudden everybody's going to cry back, "We want everything on-prem." So I mean, it is somewhat cyclical, and I've seen that even over my years of being in the industry.
There's a Dilbert cartoon from the late 80s, shows how old it is, where the boss is like showing the decentralized org chart and saying, "We need more centralization." And then 3 months later, it's the same boss. It's the boss showing the centralized chart. We need more decentralization.
Hmm.
All right, I think that covers all of the questions. I don't think I missed any of them in chat here. Though if you do have questions, last minute, furiously type as fast as you can to get them in.
Yeah, and while they're doing that, I want to thank you guys for letting me present. I hope you found it to be educational, and just again encourage you guys, if you have ever thought about presenting and have not, I'd really encourage you. You learn a lot more by preparing yourself, because you want to share with people, and you want to share out of that knowledge, and so you own it. And so being able to, you own something when you can actually teach it to somebody else. And so I've learned far more in this whole exercise than I ever really thought I would. And so I really encourage you guys to consider being a presenter, Either it's regional SQL Saturdays or some of your local user group meetings. It's a really educational and good process to learn for yourself. But I think you have a lot to share with other people that other people can benefit from. So
Yeah, I second that. Anybody who is interested in speaking, get a hold of me. We've got slots. I can't leave the house very much, so I've got nothing to do.
yeah,
All right.
and honestly, virtual is kind of an easy way to do it because you're not facing the crowd, which I mean that could be hard, but at the same time, eh, I'm not seeing faces look back at me and like wonder about me or
So last question. It looks like what was your Twitter handle again?
uh, at Hambone DBA.
All right, I'll type that out so that there we go. Wonderful. So thank you very much for presenting tonight.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Excellent session. Definitely a great topic. Very interesting. And with that, I'm going to bid everybody once more adieu. Uh, Tomorrow, we have Jason Brimhall talking to us about indexing, but it's at a special time, 4 p.m. It's going to be 1 hour. Jason had to squeeze it into a schedule. It was a very tight schedule. So we're going to start 4 o'clock sharp. So come by, check us out again tomorrow or next time you're around. Thanks, everybody, and catch you next stream.
All right. Have a great evening.